Good evening, participants. Welcome back to lecture number 3 of our 15-day lecture series, History of English Literature. Today, we have among us a very young and erudite scholar, Dr. Bhawna Vij Arora, who presently is working as an assistant professor at Vivekananda Institute of Professional Studies in Pitampura, Delhi, which is affiliated to Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University, Dwarka, New Delhi. Her research foregrounds gender studies and women's writing, modern European drama, Indian women's poetry, cinema of resistance. In the past, she had been the recipient of Fulbright scholarship to Yale University in the year 2015-16 as a language teaching assistant. She has also received Indraprasth Research Fellowship under the University School of Humanities and Social Sciences in the year 2013-14. Her teaching experience include teaching at Bharati College, Delhi University, Northern Indian Engineering College, Netaji Subhas University of Technology, Delhi, and Delhi Technological University in the guest capacities. She has presented her articles and papers in the conferences held by Delhi University, Mumbai University, Punjab University, Central University of Kerala, Old Dominion University, Virginia State University, United States, to name a few. As a committed academician, her articles have been published in journals of known repute and academic periodicals as well. In the past, she also had made a documentary project under the aegis of Digital Media Center for the Arts, Yale University, in the year 2015-16. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, ma'am, we wholeheartedly welcome you on this platform. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and willing to speak on this important and interesting topic. I can assure you on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE and on behalf of Dr. Bhawna Arora to our dear participants that we are in for a cerebral treat today. Without wasting much time, I request the platform is all yours, Dr. Bhawna.
Thank you. Thanks to all the participants out here. We are looking forward to this series. And of course, I'll take a quick second to share my screen. I think you need to allow me the... Okay, so we are going to talk about the age of Queen Elizabeth, that is from 1558 to 1603, and we'll delve into the details of the history, the Zeitgeist, the society, and its literary splendor. The Zeitgeist, the spirit of the particular time and age, and the ultimate reasons and causes, the causal factors that led to the literary splendor, some of the outstanding works that was produced during this era. And I'm moving ahead. A vital literary culture is the product of a complex process, and it involves thousands of modest, half-hidden circumstances and creative acts sparked by a wide range of motives. And these motives exactly are what we are looking for and trying to create a narrative. I'm a person who is moved by narratives, and if I understand and if I get to closer towards the zeitgeist of an age, the spirit of the age, the works and precisely in which probable causes and how they turned out to be the most outstanding work, it makes it more convincing. So this disposition would, however, be circumscribed to some of the watershed moments, landmark events, and crucial turning points of the Queen Elizabeth's reign. Language, culture, politics, history, hereditary literary practices, they all will be explored to fathom the zeitgeist of the age, zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. Now, of course, a little going into the background of, and I'm sure you must have read it already, I'm sure you must have attended previous day's lecture and a couple of these incidents and landmark historical events that has taken place earlier. One of them had been the War of Roses. War of Roses, a series of the 15th century English civil wars for the throne of English, which was fought between two rival cadet branches, House of Lancaster and House of York. So this War of Roses had been such that the social and economic health of the nation, this was severely damaged, economic health of the nation of England, it was severely damaged by the War of the Roses, and This was almost a vicious, a decade-long struggle for royal power between, as I said, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Now, finally, the struggle was resolved by the establishment of the Tudor dynasty that ruled from 1485 to 1603. And going by what led to and what about this Tudor dynasty, this has not been a very legitimate claimants to power. The family name, in fact, was Owen Tudor, and this was a very ambitious Welshman, no legitimate claim to throne. But he happened to have married Catherine of Valois, and she was the widow of the Lancastrian King Henry V. And their grandson became the first Tudor monarch, known as Henry VII in 1485. Now, if you can see the chronology on the screen, it's 1485, accession of King Henry VII. He inaugurated the Tudor dynasty, and then 1509, accession of Henry VIII. Now, but before that, Henry VII was astute, very astute and clever monarch, someone who promptly consolidated his rather shaky claim to the throne. How? By marrying a woman of the House of York, by marrying Elizabeth, a woman called, of course, the House of York. And of course, he was strategically able to unite the two rival factions together. Why? Because he himself had the lineage from the House of Lancaster, and he ended up marrying Elizabeth of House of York. And this way, he was able to, in a way, maneuver his political shaky claim quite successfully. And of course, there have been other instances too, the other factions in the society too. For example, the barons were there, and the English barons, they were very much divided by the dynasty wars. They could not claim absolutely, or they could not claim any powers to the crown, or they could oppose the powers to the crown. And the leaders of the church as well, they could not somehow consolidate themselves to be against Henry VII. And that's how the very clever Henry VII, he was able to counter the multiple and competing power structures, balance them out characteristically of a typical of a feudal society of England, and imposed a much more stronger authority, a central kind of an authority over the entire nation, right? And this consolidation of power, this progressed through 16th century. It progressed throughout, in fact, 16th century, up until we find that Henry VII's granddaughter, who will be, say, Queen Elizabeth VII, the very work that we are going to understand today, she would be that ruler who in a way consolidated this power way more than her ancestors. And of course, there have been other limitations on these kings as well. For example, they needed at every stage, they would need consent of the parliament on crucial matters, on taxes and other such matters by which they can be a burden on they can levy certain taxes from the people. So it wasn't that monarchs were all powerful, but they certainly included the consent of the parliament. They would need the consent of the parliament on crucial matters. Now, we will come directly onto, because we are going to begin with accession of Queen Elizabeth, and of course also take into account, as it is mentioned on the screen, 1509 accession of Henry VIII, then Martin Luther's thesis, Martin Luther King, how he rose up to power, and he was primarily a proponent of Reformation. And then Henry VIII, he declared himself as the head of the church. So that's how the narrative is built around what led to the circumstances where the accession of Queen Elizabeth I when she came to power. Now, one important component of, before we jump onto this bandwagon of understanding Queen Elizabethan times, one important factor that took place, a kind of zeitgeist moment, a shift of thought, of spirit of thought that took place, was Renaissance and Renaissance humanism. So let's first of all, one by one, take up these terms. And I'm sure it might be a case that participants, audiences, students, scholars, professors out there, they're quite already aware of it, but as part of the analytical one, if we try and understand. Renaissance, one way of viewing Renaissance would be to place it in its historical sense. That is, Renaissance, when it is usually associated with a series of cultural changes that affected first in Italy in the 14th century, and then of course it spread itself out to other parts of Europe. Now, another one would be this was more or less kind of the social change that took place, the historical change that took place thanks to Renaissance. Another is, of course, the literal meaning of Renaissance, which is nothing but rebirth, anything which takes birth again. Rebirth, that is a period in the history of Europe which was post-medieval and something wherein it was distinguished from the previous ones by its renewed focus on classical studies. So it was more of a rebirth of letters and arts and the materiality of it. Materiality, that is the very recovery of the texts and artifacts from classical antiquity, the development of different perspectives, the development of linear perspective, certain new practices in aesthetics based on imitating from or taking up or as inspiration from the classical models. So all in all, it was the materiality of it that found its echoes in this Renaissance period altogether. Now, apart from the renewal or the reinvention of or the revisitation of the classical scholarship, this also saw the beginning of scientific revolution and almost an unprecedented, never before emphasis on scientific explorations, seafaring routes explorations and discoveries in almost all spheres, all walks of life. Now, this very curiosity, this way of exploring the world together, it unleashed new ideas, it created new social and political and economic forces that somehow gradually displaced the older and replaced the older values of the Middle Ages. Now, when I say the value of Middle Ages, I don't mean some barbaric, some infernal, these kind of values of the Middle Ages, but simply the unsophisticated, the primitive, the communal values of the Middle Ages. They started to get wither away, and soon they were getting replaced with the formation of new ideas, the emphasis on new subject matters, and so forth. Right? The second word that I've taken into account in the title is humanism. Just explaining out the basic meaning of these two terms. Humanism was more rather a literary vision and a kind of intellectual program of England that saw itself bound up with primarily on the struggles of or on the purpose of education at large. And this saw itself primarily materializing in the curriculum reform of Queen Elizabeth. Not Queen Elizabeth, but this entire period that came up right before Queen Elizabeth was officially placed onto the throne. So when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, she was given much of these conducive situations, unlike the things that had been happening religiously. Of course, there had been a lot of struggles, there had been a lot of factions, turbulations in the religious life, but more or less this shift in an emphasis on the readership, on the curriculum, on the education system altogether, this somewhat also changed the shift of thought. This somehow also concretely brought a shift of thought. So there was this overall, if I may use the word, a holistic kind of a shift that was taking place. And this still, though it was based on the primary subjects of, say, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So these subjects were never replaced. But to add to them, the great classical models were studied with a vigorous force. The students would end up critically analyzing the texts of these great masters and learning the verses and reading through the technical virtuosity of the past masters. And this way, this grown-up interest, this revival of interest in the classical ones happened. But of course, the emphasis on grammar remained, the emphasis on logic remained, the emphasis on rhetoric remained, the medieval tribe of subjects that we really call. And apart from that, the usual arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, the quadrivium interest also remained. But the focus now shifted from the trainings given by the church to the general acquisition of literature. General acquisition of literature, both of the literary knowledge and of course of the cultural knowledge. Typically, it found itself its greatest echoes in the schools, and these schools would sought to give such facility, such rhetorical elegance to its students that the students would laboriously put effort to comprehend the literary styles, the classical masters, going into the details of what these dramatists had said, how they've written, what forms they were conveying, Plutarch, Terence, Seneca, poets such as Virgil and Horace, orators, even Cicero was the most important one. So overall, they were studied for their moral, political, and philosophical truths, and not just the emphasis on scholastic knowledge based on hair splitting details of logical, say logic, rhetoric, and other subject matters, right? Now, another important component of English Renaissance, it was, in fact, this was kind of prevalent throughout the Europe. And this important component was an expansion of the reading public, the expansion of the consumption of these readable texts, and with it came the very allure, the very attraction for the power and allure of the vernacular languages. And these two impulses, that is the humanist reverence for the classics and especially the English pride in the vernacular language, they gave rise to the many translations that happened in the period. So this explains the fact that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was translated by George Chapman. Ovid's Metamorphoses was translated by Arthur Golding, and even Castiglione's Il Cortegiano, this was again translated in different vernacular languages. Ariosto's Orlando, the Italian poet Furioso, it got translated. This explains why the typical writer, poet, author of the Queen Elizabethan reign had such a great repertoire of knowledge available to them, because the translations of it had already been in vogue in its practice. And thanks to Renaissance and Renaissance humanism, this very practice of translation, this very practice of introducing greatest of the works of the times in vernacular languages helped them to pick up the sources rightly, the plots, the ideas, the characters very freely, and move ahead and bring down their own particular innovations of the age, right? So I'll quickly read from the screen here. During the 15th century, a few English clerics and government officials, they had journeyed to Italy and had seen an extraordinary cultural and intellectual movement that is flourishing in city-states of Italy. In Italy, there was this interest in the Greek and Roman writers in the pre-Renaissance period. It was certainly there when this transition from the medieval towards the next period that, if I may assume, was taking place, but only when it became more pronounced by the time we reach 1500 that we find that classical masters were reinvented, reimagined, and their studies and their emphasis took place the entire center stage of the literary landscape. So to Renaissance intellectuals and artists, the achievement of the pagan philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome came to seem more compelling than the subtle distinctions drawn by medieval Christian theologians. Now, Florence was the major site of, and apart from this, I would in fact quickly like to mention here, not just the reinterest in the classical antiquity, the text of the antiquity, the classical masters, it was also about the scientific discoveries that was taking place, and the important discoverers of the age, Nicholas Copernicus, the very popular astronomer, polymath, and who brought out this heliocentric theory, sun being the stationary and at the center. Of course, this was negated later on, of course, but initially with that very proposal of these theories in the background, it in a way reinvigorated the dormant spirit of the previous age. Right? And then there had been Johannes Kepler. Johannes Kepler, he was a very popular German astronomer, and he brought out the different laws of the planets and the planetary positions and the planetary movement and their relationship and so forth. So this, of course, became the idea that certainly man is at the center, but there had been other of these different planets and, of course, existing astronomical inventions that are out there, waiting to be explored by me. And the very visits of these merchants to different seafaring routes, exploring the different nations altogether. For example, Amerigo Vespucci. Now, Vespucci, he ended up publishing whatever narratives, whatever accounts, visitations he had made, whatever voyages he made to and found these newly discovered land across the Atlantic Ocean. When he came back, he got them published. And this written narrative, they in a way disclosed, it opened up the whole different avenues of the whole world. And somehow it organized itself on the principles of what else could be the other means by which European societies could be governed. In fact, Amerigo Vespucci's very sea voyaging experiences, sea voyages, they became the very material for, or that source material for Thomas More's utopia. And he could imagine this alternative world as against what had been in England, only because he himself, and of course, this has been found that Vespucci's letters, his reportages, his voyages, descriptions, his narratives, they were a source of inspiration for Thomas More's Utopia. So Florence was the major site of such interest. Florence in Italy. Florence was the major site of such interest in learning, and Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch were all Florentines. Now, the position of Florence was such that it offered the very conducive climate for the situation of the humanist inquiries to take place and flourish themselves and to achieve to some fruition. The idea of Renaissance, although it spread very quickly to other parts of and other towns and parts of Europe, but it was primarily in Italy that it found its new learning, not just in particular fields of, say, painting, architecture, or maybe literature, but almost in all subjects of choice. This was seen as the epicenter of Renaissance. Right? Now, the question is also why Italy? Why not any other place? Number one, of course, Spain was already going through 15th century. It had been marred with a number of these attacks by these Muslim invaders and could not find itself settled enough to bring out that golden age probably of Spanish drama, right? And France again was marred by a lot of these religious conflicts around. Germany still again, Renaissance in fact reached quite late in these places. And all in all we find, and of course Russia and other countries of and continents in Europe, they could not find themselves as appropriate of a conducive environment that Italy gave them. Right? And of course, another important reason, because Italy was somehow able to bring out again this harmony between the nobility and the merchants, and this in a way worked to create that cosmopolitan climate, that climate of sir, I hope I'm audible. Yes, am I audible? Yeah, am I audible? Okay, now it seems the screen is. This was because the very ability of the nobility and merchant class, when they worked in tandem with one another, there was this cosmopolitan climate that was created, and the patronages of the wealthy, almost a proximity to the past work of the classical antiquities, they provided a very easy, conducive models to the ancient Greek and Latin resources. And this became primarily the source of inspiration, the source of consultation. And eventually it became a reinvention of their own heritage, the reinvention of their own, almost a reinvention of their own civilization. Now this somehow was coming from all the way from the classical antiquities. And again, another question that comes into being, why classical masters? Why classical writers? Of course, this is more like an obvious one, because these classical writers, they were more like the exemplars of eloquent expression. They were the almost repository of perennial, forever wisdom that these work contained. And in whatever ways that they produced, this was not just confined to literature. They were spreading out the overall epistemologies of knowledge. They were bringing out the overall discoveries of how societies and how politics, how states, how civil societies are governed and carried out. So classical antiquities, classical writers turned out to be the perfect model. Now, the focus for Petrarch shifted from dry study of syllogism in a school to a more serious and as I'm reading from the screen. So Petrarch, Francisco Petrarch, one of the very important figures of, seminal figures of Italian Renaissance, and primarily he advocated the cultivation of literary fluency, and this he introduced as the primary component, that is the cultivation of literary fluency as the proper component of an intellectual climate. First, Petrarch, he imitated the Latin models, just like many of the other poets and writers, but he was also responsible for developing a humanist program that all the moral treatises that he has ever written more had been initially in the Latin verse compositions, and these moral treatises ultimately helped him to discover a new kind of a form, his own Italian composition that were Italian sonnets. More popularly, they were known as, by his very name, after almost became an epitome of these sonnets, that is known as Petrarchan sonnets, right? But he emphasized initially on the literary fluency, for that proper intellectual climate. And of course, he had in his own capacities written these number of moral treatises as well. But ultimately, we know Petrarch, and of course, the way he inspired the Italian sonnet tradition was the way, of course, that the very sonnet tradition had been emerged after him, and the way it was imitated then in England. So the focus for Petrarch shifted from dry study of syllogisms in schools to a more serious and intense pursuit of wisdom. This is where I said that the very literary fluency could be cooperated, could be perpetuated only when the movement from dry study of syllogisms need to, of course, make a movement towards intelligent pursuits of wisdom. In the brilliant, intensely competitive and vital world of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, the submission of the human spirit to penitential disciplines that gave way to unleashed curiosity, individual self-assertion, and a powerful conviction that man was the measure of all things. And this precisely has been picked up to be the part of the slide to explain out what humanism meant. And though humanism precisely is to be seen in its materiality of it, it was more of an education-based kind of a reform, a vision that was carried out in schools and in curriculum. But man being the center, man being the measure of all things, it primarily emphasized on the quality and ability of the man to be able to, of course, carry out the things on he being at the center. And of course, this another important quote that explains out Renaissance humanism. God says to Adam in the Florentine Piccola Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of the Man, 1486, and I'm reading from the screen. We have made thee neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, said God to Adam in Florence Mirandola's Oration of the Dignity of Man, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as though the maker and molder of thyself, thou may fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer. Right? The very concept of Renaissance humanism precisely being explained in threefold lines. So the three themes of Renaissance humanism were historical research, discovery through these past research, rediscovery and reinvention of the classics, and of course the renewed emphasis on the dignity of man being at the center of the rest of the world. So in simple words, humanism was an engagement that sought to elevate man to a stature that would do justice to his potential. The focus for the humanists was a reconciliation of participation and thought, which aimed to develop the individuality of a man in a way that lived up to the ideals of a Renaissance man. It placed man at the center, but not in opposition to society and culture, but more or less concomitantly as parallel to society and culture, not away from it, but certainly in tandem with where society and culture was moving. This combination of individual and society is also reflected in the literature of the age, and of course of the writings, Thomas More's Utopia 1516 and Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. These were nothing but the lionized representations, though they appeared right before Queen Elizabeth accessed the throne, formally, officially accessed the throne, but of course these are considered as to be important texts of the times. Then other English humanists include John Colet, Roger Ascham, Sir Thomas Eliot. They all were responsible for bringing massive curriculum changes in the way Renaissance humanism found its ultimate emergence. John Colet, the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, he had recasted his grammar school on the basis of humanist principle. Roger Ascham, he wrote treatises on education to promote such learning, which prepares personals for public services. For some of the ambitious intellectual humanists, that knowledge extended to ancient Greeks, whose enthusiastic adherents began to challenge the deep preeminence of Latin. So when I emphasize that an important component of Renaissance humanism, Renaissance in England had been not just a revival of these classical texts, it was also a shift and taking pride in English language and English pride in other vernacular languages too, precisely because they were questioning, they were challenging this deep preeminence, this deep importance of Latin as a language. And that is how gradually you will see later on the way Latin and Greek, these languages somehow were pushed onto the higher tiers of language, and they somehow ended up being confined to confined to the literary elites, of course, the men of letters and elites and aristocratic families. Not every man out there, not general public, could learn Latin or probably these languages, right? So there were discoveries to the new worlds, explorers, of course, as I talked about the scientific discoveries, and a lot of it had to do with the astronomical positions of the planets, which somehow gave deep insights into the idea of how basically the earth could have emerged and who is at the center and how we are revolving. And all these aspects had greater impact because this was a culture which would end up discussing the new inventions discovering taking place. And of course, with the winning of it, with making different and distant seafaring routes to distant lands, discoveries of new lands, this was also marked by the moment of xenophobia, the moment of taking pride in these explorations. So these, and I'm particularly talking about England here. There were discoveries of the new world, explorers, curiosity, adventure, expansion of trade, accumulation of wealth, and geographical and intellectual expansion. And this formed the backdrop of Renaissance. Okay, so this was this on the left-hand side of it, as I see it from my side, there's this spirit of Italian Renaissance that was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. And of course, the right-hand side of it, we have the reproduction of the Gutenberg printing press. Printing press had huge impact on the masses consuming not just, in fact, these texts, these books, but also the religion. I'll come down to the idea of Reformation and, of course, Martin Luther King, who, with the help of this printing press, was probably able to democratize this religious space, which almost got stuck in the hierarchies of the church and the church authorities. So I'll come down on it in a moment. So these were different terms that now started into the being. Cartography, the fact that the new lands and new discoveries were taking place. Of course, these words had to come into being. Age of discovery, then Atlantic current, then of course the sea routes that were found. Then circumnavigation, that is all traveling all the way around something, usually around the world, and of course mapping out different zones and areas. And of course colonization, colonialism, Middle Ages, Columbian exchange, and these are the terms that somehow was also the part of Renaissance. Then in England, however, okay, so we are going to begin with the next one. So this one is back again, just to reinforce and see the chronology of that accession of Henry VII after it took place, after we have Tudor Dynasty coming into force, and Henry VII now. This had been this very period of shift from Henry VII to Henry VIII. In the background, we see that these great number of intellectuals who were making the visits to nearby neighborhood countries, and of course to France, to Italy, and in Italy precisely they found this new things happening and new ideas being spread out, which they would want to bring it back to their own country, to their own place. But this was also the age which has seen some of the serious ideological and institutional tensions in the religious life of England, and that precisely became one of the reasons why the shifts of reign took place, and we finally come down to Queen Elizabethan times. So officially, at least England in the early 16th century was and it had a single religion called Roman Catholicism, and this religion whose popular head, whose acknowledged head was Pope in Rome. But the faithful adherents of the Roman Catholic, that is one who would swear by church and see church as the only central institution in their lives, this gave somehow, church became that kind of central institution which gave them a sort of universal and infallible guide as to how to conduct yourself, as to how the human existence should have been from the moment of birth to death, from cradle to grave, and how to move on into the life to come. And this was so much deeply embedded, these teachings, the authority and the hold that church has was so much so that the masses generally would be instructed by the church's teachings. They would be corrected. They would correct their discipline. They would be corrected by its discipline. They would, be sustained by its sacraments. Almost unequivocally, every promise, every teaching that church as an authority, of course, with the religion had, they promised comfort to the man. And this was not just some false promises being made and people grew tired of it and they started revolting. No, this was absolutely a vast, deeply entrenched system of certain ritualistic and doctrinal forces in the being. So ritualistic, there had been vast systems of confessions, there had been pardons, penance, indulgences, sacred relics, and too much emphasis on these relics, sacred doctrinal relics, and then ceremonies. This, in a way, also gave immense power to the male clerics, to the different hierarchical positions that church had employed, and of course, different men that were employed. And with this, male clerics, Pope, the Bible, the liturgy, most of them, they became the center of theological discussions. And to add to it, these central theological discussions were all in Latin. So one can understand primarily why it was so distant off, cut off from the real masses out there, from the real people who would not probably understand these things in Latin language, and would certainly need a middleman to come up with their confessions, to ask for pardons, to ask for penance, and to indulge in these ceremonies and so forth. And not just these relics, these ceremonies, many of these key doctrines and practices of the Catholic Church, they had been somehow already, they have started to be challenged. In a way, the authority of the church had been started to get challenged in 14th century, but it was, and if you remember your yesterday's, I'm sure if you've attended and remember your yesterday's lecture, the teachings of Wycliffe, John Wycliffe and his followers, Lollards, right? They, in a way, already started this rebel against the church and its authority. But these embers of dissent, that fire was once again ignited, that fire came into being only when Martin Luther, and of course, he himself had been one of the priests in Germany, German priest he was, when this was again reignited by Martin Luther in Germany, who happened to have been a priest, and of course, a professor of theology in itself, right? So it was Luther, it was Martin Luther who rose up against the ancient church and challenged the Pope of his hierarchy of corruption, right? And he propounded, in fact, very vigorously, he came out and suggested and pointed out that only scriptures, not the church, not the clerical hierarchy, not these middlemen on the traditional middlemen hierarchy positions that they had been occupying since ages, they do not have absolute authority. Only the scriptures have authority in matters of religion that should determine what and how an individual should proceed in their life, right? So this is almost a suggestion that the very belief in a particular religion, that is Roman Catholicism, and of course the practice of it, this can happen, the faith can be exercised by the individual, and of course Christian salvation can be achieved by the individual, not by way of very scrupulously and hair-splitting ways of observing these religious rituals, which anyways will be guided by these male clerics and these middlemen, for that matter. A man is capable of approaching his own salvation too, on its own basis, right? So this salvation, it depended entirely on the individual, upon all the people when of course they can read the scriptures, they can have a direct access to the word of God, in a way democratizing that very religious sphere which has been somehow occupied by these male clerics and of course the religious, the men who officially be the spokesperson and the diktats of religion, right? So the moment the word of God can be directly accessed to these people, to the masses at large. That means one way of suggesting is that you are in a way democratizing, you're liberating Bible with the help of vernacular translations from these religious and these, of course, the linguistic clutches as well, and you're bringing it at the desk of the every man, and someone who can access it readily and read it and maybe probably think of his own afterlife and religious salvation and so forth. So this is where the very demand for reforming the doctrinal principles, the institutional structures of this church, it began to happen. Reformation, and I'm reading from the screen. Reformation of the church was a major 16th century religious restructuring that resulted in the dilution of supremacy of the Pope in Western Europe. One immediate consequence of the Reformation was the founding of Protestant institutions that both rivaled Catholicism and presented a spiritual alternative to the contemporary man. The challenge to the Catholic Church is said to have begun with Martin Luther, but the conditions of a revolt had been there right before him. And of course, men have John Wycliffe and his followers, Lollards, have raised their voice against it. But the conditions of a revolt and reaction had been there, of course, as I'm reading from the screen, clerical institutions for centuries before him. Many historical factors contributed to the disillusionment, leading to the idea of Reformation. Now, in England, this Reformation, it began less with, this was Martin Luther was a German one, and of course at different other places too. In Geneva, we have in Geneva and other parts of Europe, we have great men, priests as well, who have risen against these typical of the these ideas behind the very traditional form of Roman Catholicism, and if not very consistently, if not as a revolt, as a rebellion, as a revolution at one place, but it was certainly scattered, but certainly the shift was in popular vogue and it was taking place. So, as I said, that in England, it was more about the idea of how to keep intact the dynasty than the idea that came up with, say, Reformation. So Reformation in England came primarily, it emerged primarily, it began less with popular discontent against Catholicism, again, Roman Catholic religion, and theological disputations that had been taking place. And this was more about the dynastic politics and a sort of dynastic greed as to have the son, to have their own son to be placed on the reins, right? And with this, we have the reign of Henry VIII, formally beginning, someone who had received from Pope Leo X the very title of Defender of Faith. And in fact, this very title of Defender of Faith that Henry VIII managed to get it from Pope in Rome, this was given for his writing a diatribe against Martin Luther, right? And there had been, as you can see on the screen, there had been other reasons as well why the Reformation, economically, structurally, it was taking place. Okay. Okay. This is something that has been discussed. So the rule of Henry VIII, it broke away, and these images are taken from different sources and different search engines. They are out there freely available, and declamation has been made. So the rule of Henry VIII broke from Roman Catholic Church. Why? Because the only problem Henry VIII probably had, he craved for a legitimate son to succeed his throne, but his queen, his wife, first, Catherine of Aragon, could not give him one. She had bore 6 children, but most of them did not survive, and only one daughter, Queen Mary, she says, somehow managed to survive, and this somehow led Henry VIII to marry again, and almost 6 times he married just with a desire to get a male heir to avoid any rival claims to the throne, right? And of course, his marriages out of wedlock, and this in a way also troubled the post because this provision of divorce was not there, and he somehow convinced the church and of course the Roman Catholic Pope and the church that divorce was the needed. And this primarily also became the reason why Henry VIII parted ways with the Roman Catholic Church, because he wanted to have a son, and of course that could not be well produced by Catherine of Aragon, and he looked ahead marrying 4 times, 5 times, 6 times just to have the son. And of course this led to his absolute dispute, a kind of, he became at loggerheads with the church in Rome. So Henry, I'm reading from the screen, Henry wanted a divorce, but Pope Clement VII wouldn't invalidate the marriage. Henry tried to get church to do what he wanted and appointed Sir Thomas More as the English cardinal. More also did not support the divorce, and as a result, he was of course, he had to appear in the Tower of London. Henry proceeded to dissolve his ties with Pope, and he took then the control of the English clergy and had himself appointed the head of the new Church of England. So by law, with this very 6th marriage, he had this son, Edward, and he somehow took the throne, but at the age of 9, he died quite young. And this right somehow all became a matter of confusion as to, he died at the age of 15, that who would now rule the reign. So the crown then went to Mary, the same daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Mary then ruled only for 5 years until her death at 42. Having no heirs herself, the crown then went to Queen Elizabeth, daughter of Henry and Anne Boyle. Now, Anne Boyle, she happened to be the second wife of, I think, second or third wife of Henry VIII. Then, now is something, an important aspect of the zeitgeist that we have been talking of, what led to the circumstances which were given to Queen Elizabeth, a queen, a female monarch in a male world, number one, and the literary splendor that we face, the literary splendor, and of course the outstanding works, the magnificence of Shakespeare and these poets, Spenser, Sidney, and so forth, they were brought down, all thanks to the previous conditions that found it themselves to be conducive to such an environment. So a female monarch in the male world, Queen Elizabeth. Well, doubts and allegations were cast against Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth's reign. Why? Because they were questioned for the ability of a woman to assume these positions. And in the last years of Minister John Knox, who clamored, he called it, very pathetically, he called it the monstrous regime. The monster, a lot of few men, these two women, first of all, to come to the throne, somehow unsuited to wield power over men, and ultimately the power must go up in the hands of a male heir, right? And obviously they believe, and they seem to have regarded, this primarily was based on the fact that men are equivalent to, or they are associated usually with the head, and women with heart, that the rational thought is the prerogative somehow of men only, and it is the exclusivity of male only. It's the male passion, while emotions, passions is something is to be related to women. But the supporters of Queen were certainly there. They countered these prejudices quite well. They took instances from history. They made many of these precedents in past. They established these precedents. In religion also, this has been there. Deborah, if you've heard of her, Deborah was a very popular biblical prophetess who ruled and who almost emerged as one of the gods of Israelites, and she was the fourth judge of the pre-monarchical Israel, and she was the only judge, female ruler and female judge mentioned in the Bible. So these instances, these precedences from the past were established to, of course, bring out this conclusion, this emphasis that a queen, a woman, is equally capable of ruling such a large area. And of course, quite ironically, this ended up becoming one of the most glorious ages that British England, or in fact, literary history of British England, the literary periodizations had ever seen, quite ironically. So she was educated under distinguished tutors of the age. She encouraged and strategically launched Protestantism as official religion of England. The maiden queen's position and perceived eligibility, there's an error here, perceived eligibility was a vital factor in the complex machinations of international diplomacy. Now, this is an important one, because when the very allegations of women being incapable and monsters, and the monstrous regiment of women should be discarded and so forth, many of the lawyers of the crown of monarch, they defended this rule. They brought out an important theory of king's bodies, that a king has two bodies. The king, or the queen, basically a ruler, has two bodies. One is the body of the physical body, anatomical component of the body that has been talked of. And as a crown head of England, as a crown head of any country, this also means a symbolic body. So going by the physicality of it, it might be a body of a weak female monarch. It might be the weak female, but the symbolism that underlying this very theory of king's body had been that the heart and stomach of it had been of a great ruler, of a great master, of a king, in other words. Though still it's a sexist one, but the heart and stomach of a king, and irrespective of the fact it's being a feeble, and of course a weak and feeble body of a female. So as a crown head of England, Queen Elizabeth, she in a way was very able to, throughout her reign, she was able to mystically divide her mortal, physical, weak, feeble body, body natural, and the immortal body politic. That is the machinations, cunningness, and the strategically balancing off and sabotaging certain nations and preserving from the attacks and so forth. This was somehow she was able to immortalize this body politic as well, right? So that is to say, a simple, brilliant combination of could be a weaker body for them to be believed of, but certainly strategically one of the most cognitively intelligent woman, well-read woman as well. She was educated, as it is written on screen, she was educated under distinguished tutors of the age, and she encouraged and strategically launched Protestantism. The maiden queen position perceived eligibility was a vital factor in the complex machinations of international diplomacy. So politically, she had to rule with a lot of these strategizing, maneuvering, and also her very perceived eligibility, her maidenhood gave her that crucial factor, became a crucial factor in that complex machinations of international diplomacy. Who will ultimately this reign? Who would Queen, this woman be marrying? So this maidenhood status, in a way, became a matter of quite a lot of speculation, and this speculation gave rise to somehow balancing of this international diplomacy and various power factions in Europe as a continent, right? So why? Because simply, of course, if queen selects, of course, the king of a particular place or a particular nation, this would be a dynastic marriage, and a dynastic marriage between Queen of England, who reinforces, who, if not a very clear position about the religion, and a foreign ruler, whosoever it might be, this would in a way also forge an alliance. This would also forge such a kind of alliance that can, that can sufficiently alter the future power, the future course of the entire world's history. That is why her position was quite an important one. But this woman was quite a clever one. This was quite a clever act too. And the Pope, as he declared her, but of course she had to face a lot of these men who were against her reign, and the Pope, in fact, he declared her illegitimate in 1570, and he released her subjects from obedience to her. Several conspiracies threatened, and she was, in fact, throughout her life, she was marred by a lot of these conspiracies and plannings that were out there for her murder, and her constant advisors would update her with a lot of these spies that were out there, spread out so as to save the life of the queen. And of course, her very cousin, it was believed that she has plotted, Queen Mary has plotted the murder of the queen. And of course, she had to, she had no other option but to put her in the Tower of London and, of course, give her this extreme punishment as to that she has to die. Anyway, so we move ahead. So Elizabeth was cautious in foreign affairs, maneuvering between major powers of France and Spain. Spain, because Queen Mary she belonged to the Spanish family. Her father and of course brothers were the kings of Spain, Spanish rule, and of course this somehow strategically need to always become the source of danger for Queen Elizabeth. She only half-heartedly supported a number of ineffective, poorly rescued military campaigns in the Netherlands, France, and Ireland. By the mid-1580s, England could no longer avoid war with Spain, and England's victory against the Spanish Armada gave a very kind of reinvigorated and that dormant desire to have those xenophobia, taking pride in one's culture and one's nation. And this was primarily achieved with the winning of the Spanish Armada, which was also symbolically a winning against who was supposed to rule, if not Queen Elizabeth, right? So Spanish Armada in 1588 associated Elizabeth with one of the greatest military victories in English history. Queen Elizabeth's personal religious convictions had been much debated by scholars. She was a Protestant, but also kept certain Catholic symbols, such as crucifix, and of course, downplayed the roles of sermons in defiance of a pre-Protestant belief. Now, the period after the defeat of Spanish Armada in 1588, it brought new difficulties for Queen Elizabeth, and of course, it lasted until the end of her reign. The conflicts with Spain and in Ireland, they dragged on. The tax burden grew heavier. So all the glory and the unmatched potential that we talk of Queen Elizabeth's time, it also had its darker side, and the economy was hit by, as you can see and read it on your screen, and the economy was hit by poor harvest and the cost of war, prices rose and standard of life fell. During this time, the repression of Catholics intensified, and Queen Elizabeth authorized commissions in 1581 to interrogate and monitor Catholic household. And eventually, the purpose was to discard of, to break down all these maneuverings that had been taking place. And that precisely is the reason number of her spies had been working intensely, closely with her advisors to keep her updated about the number of these murder plots that had been after her. Okay, the extraordinary events of Tudor era, from the encounter with the New World to the break with Roman, made many people newly aware of their Englishness. Combined with this was aggressive nationalism, extremely important, the xenophobia that came with it. Elizabeth also invested in other enterprises, clandestine acts of piracy, trade carrying African slaves to the New World happened under the approved eye of benign queen. So it's not that racism and the idea of slavery has been quite a new one. In fact, its traces can be found long before the 14th, 15th century. The exploits of Francis Drake sailing through the Strait of Magellan pillaged Spanish towns on the Pacific, and this also gave lot of wealth to Queen Elizabeth. And she gave him this title, in fact, the deck of his ship with this title called the Golden Hymn, all because the very initiation of colonization had happened during her reign, right? The wealth that was brought by Francis Drake. Writers and patrons of the age. Stationers' Company was established and received its charter in 1557. It was responsible for licensing of books after the approval from 6 privy councillors and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London. This was precisely to keep a hold over the idea of censorship, gagging all these voices which could find themselves revolting against the reigning queen, and making a complete overall absolute authority on what all activities through publications are carried out. But despite seemingly strict regulations, scandalous and malicious heretical works would never effectively were suppressed. The censorship largely focused itself on history, which often had political implications for the present, and on religious treatises. But above all, public tastes were catered to, it was taken care of. For instance, I'll come down to Shakespeare, Henry IV in part 1, it was published seven times, all thanks to the very printing press and the invention of it that took place, that the writers and patrons of the age, they could give exactly what the audiences demanded, or what the people at large, what the masses at large demanded. And that's how a play being enjoyed, a drama performance being enjoyed, led to several of its publications and a number of its literary productions as well. Okay, poetry was an indispensable social grace and a deeply pleasurable, elevated form of poetry. And of course, the drama and poetry would be discussed in detail in the coming slides. Poetry was an indispensable social grace. Now, with poetry was another reason, because this was a cult of love. The cult of love for Queen Elizabeth primarily, because a number of courtiers, advisors, they would almost be on their knees. They would approach the queen, would address her in extravagant terms, in mellifluous terms, that somehow conjoined that very romantic passion and veneration, right? Her very position of being a maiden, or whom the queen chooses as to be as her co-partner, that somehow gave rise to that cult of love. And of course, the queen herself had been well versed in different of these languages, Latin and Greek. She has read the greatest classical masters in the background, and she was truly a patron of arts and literature. She encouraged this kind of culture wherein of course poetry would be produced at large, especially in the courtly tradition. I'll come down to the courtly tradition of poetry as well. So not just courtiers, the ambassadors who would be called up from various different other European countries, these ambassadors, these parliamentarians, they all somehow submitted, they all somehow fell to the charm of Queen Elizabeth's cult of love. And Queen's gender, primarily her maidenhood, the very component of being a virgin queen, it somehow got transformed into a potential liability and as a significant asset. So what a political maneuver this woman had been, who used her virginity as a significant asset, as a potential liability to bring tremors across the world. And of course, at the same time, be a patron of arts and literature as well. So that's how she turned in fact, she was turned in poetry, she was turned into this sacred image, this exotic image, this religious cult of love that came up, to which almost all the ambassadors, courtiers, parliamentarians, advisors, leading artists, leading poets of the age, the suitors, the potential suitors, they had somehow submitted themselves. Great poet, poet laureate, Edmund Spenser, who himself wanted, who was quite aspiring for this poet laureateship, was quite aspiring for this patronage from the Queen. Not just, in fact, Spenser, Edmund Spenser, Nicholas, the painter I'm talking of, they all celebrated the Queen. They all celebrated, and they attached this notion of some sort of mystery around the Queen's existence, Queen's mystery, as if she's some goddess of some mythology and some heroine in the Bible, and would continuously find herself being compared to Diana, to Deborah, the very queen that had ruled, that had been one of the judges of Israel, then Astrea, Cynthia, all these characters not just in Bible, but of course of the classical antiquity of the Bible as well. They found, of course, they found an equal analogy with that of Queen. And this cult of Elizabeth was both secular and religious, and became primarily one of the reasons why the Petrarchan sonnet tradition or the English poetry came into being. I talked of Edmund Spenser, which we'll discuss in a short while. Edmund Spenser, Fair Queen, was precisely dedicated for this reason. Number one, for his own ambition to be a poet laureate. Number two, very much on the lines of the greatest master, the greatest poet master, Virgil, how he himself initiated writing on pastoral poetry and then moved on to impress and bring out an epic for the nation. Similarly, Edmund Spenser, he initiated with pastoral poetry, as if this was, yes, an unsaid rule that anyone aspiring for poet laureateship would eventually begin their careers with writing pastoral poems, pastoral poetry. And of course, he began with the Shepherd's Calendar, and they later on wrote The Fair Queen, gave England this great epic called The Fair Queen. But this cult of love was not just, say, as I was talking about it, this cult of love was not just in spiritual terms, comparing her with some mythological goddesses in past. It was equally secular. Secular because her courtiers, her advisors would pine for her and, would write down such verses and would even call her a cruel, chaste mistress, which has been very much, which found its echoes with Petrarchan tradition, and that's how this whole tradition of poetry started to emerge, right? So, and of course, religious, because under different of these religions, Protestantism she encouraged, but she was also believed to have been following these artifacts as well of the Roman Catholic Church. So this position was largely unclear about Queen Elizabeth's religion, but she was very strategically, balancing it one with other, against other, right? So this was almost a semi-divine Queen of England, whose position herself, who provided a kind of vantage position for these greatest poetic works and drama as well, to be able to use in time. Then with this came the idea of patronages as well. Patronages, because this patronage system had been one of the crucial factors why the poets aspired to impress the Queen. And patronage would largely include not just sums of wealth, some wealth, and of course some amount in the background. It was also mean a protection from the Queen. It was also meant to provide some sort of reputation amid the circles of men of letters. So acquiring that patronage became that very competitive, gave it a very competitive edge. And all these aspiring, ambitious authors, ambitious poets, they would somehow look for court for its livelihood, for their encouragement, and of course, many times they would be rejected. Not just financial freedom, many times they won't find themselves provided with these patronages as well. John Lyly says, 1,000 hopes, but all nothing. All promises, nothing being given, right? 1,000 hopes, but all nothing. Anyway, so some Elizabethan patrons, though they were well-educated humanists, they were motivated by the aesthetic interests. And with them, patronages extended beyond the financial support to the creation of lively literary and intellectual circles that could primarily be happened amid the privileged men only, because the lowest of the low, those who were aspiring for these covetous positions, they had to have sustenance from these patrons, right? They have to have that reputation, all because they were working under some great patron, being provided that means of livelihood. So certainly for Sir Philip Sidney or Sir Earl of Surrey would not need any patron because they themselves were men of aristocracy. But for, think of John Wright, say Drayton, and of course think of Edmund Spenser, think of the university wits, the poets of the university wits. They all were struggling to gain the patronages to of course sustain their livelihood, to bring up and sustain themselves physically, right? Additionally, two universities has also considered impact on the period's literature. Marlowe and Spencer attended Oxford or Cambridge on scholarship. A group of scholars formed the Kahoot called University Wits. This included Thomas Nash, Robert Greene, George Peele, Thomas Kyde, Lyle Lodge, Thomas Lodge, and Christopher Marlowe. And in fact, the very thing that I was suggesting a while ago, that almost this came as an ambitious and competitive edge, this demand for patronage came with a competitive edge because they were almost dying under this huge debt that they had to pay for getting themselves enrolled in universities. The diary of Philip Henslow, a leading theatrical manager, has entry after entry showing university graduates in person or in depth or at best edging out a miserable existence or patching place. That means the debts of studying in these universities had been great, and that's precisely the reason, one after the other, we find this age being the prolific producer of a number of plays and number of dramas. The major playwrights, John Lyle, these are some of the major plays, and Thomas Kyde, the Spanish tragedy, again, is the important one. Okay, just a second. So John Lyle and of course Thomas Kyde, they became the inspiration of many of these tragedies that were written afterwards. But of course, before Queen Elizabeth's time, this is an important thing that needs to be mentioned, especially with these university wits. Before Queen Elizabethan times, universities, schools, they were mainly focused, and I wanted deliberately to bring it out, this validity of this point. These universities, they were mainly devoted to educating the clergymen, the sons of the gentry, the sons of the aristocratic men, right? And of course, they had to occupy the positions in the inns, the positions in the courts, and so forth, and they would be the would-be dukes and the would-be earls of the time. But with Queen Elizabeth, and of course after Renaissance humanism came up, less affluent students, those who were economically weaker, such as Marlowe and Spencer, they attended Oxford and Cambridge scholarship, and they found themselves forever trapped in this huge amounts of depth in it, right? Why I brought this up? Because we also do not find much of these women who would visit universities, who would go to colleges, etc. And particularly, women had no access to grammar schools, and probably this could be one of the reasons. Not just grammar schools, even the inns and the courts and the universities. And this probably could have been the reason why Virginia Woolf, in a room of one's own, had to imagine his character Judith Shakespeare and think about why Shakespeare's sister, had she been there, she could have born with that same genius. But because she was not allowed for the grammar school, for the university education, though Shakespeare never went as such, but of course the education that was not really there for his sister, probably she ended up committing suicide. So universities, grammar schools, inns and courts, they were, despite the Queen being on the reins and despite Queen ruling had such an important dynastic position, this was not allowed. So then it's of course the mention of the theater scene, the dramatic scene. So we are reaching. So Renaissance literature, if we take into account poetry and of course drama too, beginning with poetry, it was more of a rhetorical culture, a culture which was simply and deeply, in fact, it was steeped in the arts of persuasion. They were trained to give out and to process complex verbal, complex verbal expressions, complex verbal signals. And a permanent, the very first line, Red Lion, the first mention in 1560, Red Lion being the permanent theater house, Red Lion, the first mentioned in 1567, and James Burr Playhouse, the theatre title is theatre, was built in 1576. That means a permanent freestanding public theatre in England dates only from Shakespeare's own lifetime, and Red Lion and the theatre, 1567 and 1576, they used to, this was the time when permanent playhouses started to emerge. So it's quite misleading in a way to identify English dramas exclusively to Queen Elizabeth's reign. Why? Because these were the permanent playhouses that started to come up only in 1567, 76. But of course, there had been a rich tradition, a vital tradition in England, which almost goes back to a number of centuries, where the morality plays, the mystery plays, and these plays had been in vogue and in fashion, and they had been performed time and again, continuously throughout the year. So townspeople in late medieval England, they used to carry out these huge, elaborate cycle of plays, mystery plays, morality plays, and they depicted these greater number of biblical stories, the stories from religion, etc., just so that they can depict and induce the component of didacticism. Because obviously, because the church was in its authority, the church in fact had the absolute authority. Now, when even theatre started to find itself almost free from the clutches of this authority, church authority, the almost a ravaged way of producing mass plays and dramas happened to take place. And this precisely, I'll come down to the very journey that almost theatres and drama made, and ultimately we find in 1642, when Oliver Cromwell later came to the throne, he had to banish and of course ban these and put out the censorship and then completely ban theatre altogether. Why? Because they were seen as places of sedition. They were seen as places of all ill values in society. I'll come down to it. So performers acted in town halls, halls of guilds, and aristocratic mansions, and on pagan vagons in the streets and in innyards. And by 15th century, they were organized companies of players traveling under noble patronage, right? And the Lord Chamberlain's men, the Lord Admiral's men. So the early English theatre was not restricted to, they used to take place cycle of plays, but by the time we reach 1560s, 1570s, in fact, precisely 1570s, we find that performances used to come exponentially in different forms. And of course, almost a proliferation of these performances happened. In marketplaces, they were taking place in halls of guilds, in halls, in innyards, in mansions, and so forth. And they were precisely in innyards as well. They were precisely organized by companies who would employ the players, who would employ the actors, and they would be traveling under some noble patronage. That is why they were called the Lord Chamberlain's men, the Lord Admiral's men, right? Because these were the noble patrons who were giving out and of course employing these actors, and under their name, the enactment, the performances used to take place. And if talking about how precarious the lives of these actors had been, though it was a company that earned, but a very precarious living, and wages were given to these. Not very precarious, but not something which will make them or create that rag to riches kind of story that we usually end up associating with Shakespeare. Not Shakespeare, because his father again had been, if not a man of humble beginnings, but certainly a well-established man. So these companies, though they earned very precariously and gave very precarious, say, earning to their actors as well, but of course they provided amusement, they provided entertainment, and of course they ended up, the purpose was, number one, to provide entertainment, and second, to enhance the prestige of the patron, whose livery they bore, whose protection they enjoyed. And that is why Lord Admiral's men, Lord Chamberlain's men. And that also explains the practice why professional acting companies in Shakespeare's time, including Shakespeare's very own, he was a shareholder in Globe Theatre, they attached themselves, these actors, they attached themselves to some noble men, and they were technically, they were their servants, Lord Chamberlain's men, Lord Admiral's men, and so forth. So before this permanent of a brick and mortar kind of units of public theatre, the playing companies had been, they were not, say, club dance companies, but they were certainly performing interludes or interludes of such kind which would comment upon the moral and religious themes of the time. And the very structures of these interludes, this was slightly different from what had been there in the medieval times. This time, that is in Queen Elizabeth times, we see the interludes used to be such that they reflected a sharp training in argumentation. They were trained to bring out sharp argumentation that scholars and students would receive in typical of their schools, typical of their Tudor schools and education. And this precisely had been one of the reasons why Shakespeare's amazing ability to look at the critical issues from different sides, from multiple perspectives, from in fact a holistic way of presenting it, this was inevitably, unequivocally inspired from the dramatic interludes of the times. Certainly they were talking about the religious and moral themes, but they also had this previous training of Renaissance that happened in school, and the shift that took place because of Renaissance humanism, that is this training in sharp argumentation, the training in bringing out both the sides of a difficult question. This somehow quite helped in later age, say this age dramatists. Also, before the construction of the public theatres, the playing companies performed short plays and interludes. Another major form of theatre that flourished in England in the 15th century and continued on to the 16th century was the morality play dramatization of the spiritual struggle of the Christian soul, typical of what we find in Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. And apart from this, we have Thomas Sackville with Thomas Norton wrote the first of its tragedies. So we now formally begin with, if not begin with, kind of discussion had been by and large confined to poetry and drama as well. So Thomas Sackville with Thomas Norton, they wrote their first tragedy in black, Governor of Ferex and Forex. So we find that Thomas Norton, he was an early Protestant reformer, and Thomas Sackville, he was a fellow lawyer, and both of them together produced in collaboration, this English tragedy was produced in 1561. And this tragedy was in blank verse, and in fact, this was also translated by the greatest reformer, John Calvin, right? And this tragedy, this was following the typical of the Seneca plot, 5-act tragedy, not moving beyond 5 acts and so forth, the typical of a Seneca tragedy. And this was performed, first of all, in the very inner circle of London's law school. Also because Thomas Sackville was a fellow lawyer, and of course, Thomas Norton as well. So this was performed in London's law school, and subsequently, also, it was later on acted before the Queen. And interestingly, whatever these dramas and performances in public theatre that were taking place, they were nothing but a kind of a secondary, tertiary, quadrantary practice sessions, so that when final performance in front of the Queen, if it is and when it is taking place, it turns out to be an impeccable one, including the dramatic performances of Shakespeare. Right. So. The next in discussion is Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe, the greatest of the university wits. He was also a major Elizabethan dramatist, and he was murdered, so he had a very short career in theatre, but he produced some of the greatest work, grandest kind of a work, Tamburlaine, the Jew of Malta, Edward II, Dido, the Queen of Carthage, and of course, Dr. Faustus. So, talking about Marlowe and Christopher Marlowe, especially Tamburlaine, this was concerned with, again, a typical of a Renaissance man, if you may imagine the core of Renaissance humanism belief, that is an overreacher, an overambitious man, in fact, a dynastic king who had some larger than life kind of ambitions and who would challenge in every possible manner all human possibilities, the limits of all human possibility, right? And certain other, say, tragedies were also written of the period. And but Marlowe, more or less, because he had a short career, he was killed. He was killed at the age of 29. So he ended up, the best of his work turned out to be Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine. And of course, the Jew of Malta is obviously kind of anti-Semitic tragedy. And Tamburlaine, again, was performed at Lord Admiral's Men. Again, under that very patronage system. The major feature of it was following that very major feature, the major component of Queen Elizabethan time, that as it was written in blank verse, and almost Christopher, and this blank verse used in drama, this was somehow made to achieve its perfection by Christopher Marlowe, as if he ended up valorizing blank verse for his other contemporary dramatists, right? Now, Marlowe had been quite consistent throughout. If we notice, he had been quite consistent with his themes, with his dignified themes, in fact, of serious dramas. There would be a union of matter, there would be a union of form, but something wherein powerful characters would be edged out, who would their desires, their ambitions would overwhelm the readers, not just the readers, even the spectators, and those who would have a strong, resolute desire to conquer the world, to conquer the weak opponents, and by their very conviction, they were out there to win the world. Typical of a Renaissance humanist man at the center, but now made much more in grandiloquence, now made given this magnificent design and plot, and now with a number of course execution of it also turning out to be way more dramatically potential than a typical of a Renaissance humanism, or man being at the center of everything. And of course, Jew of Malta, as I said, this is anti-Semitic kind of a tragedy. It has elements of it has, of course, it is tragedy, but it has elements of farce as well. It has elements of comedy. It was also a satire, and of course, it discussed the life of Jew barbarous. And Edward II became. It was a remarkable experiment in the first place, Edward II, a history play, but this was something almost perfected by later on Shakespeare, or maybe had this man been alive, he could have emerged with next part of Edward II, a better one, right? So Marlowe's tragic vision overall, the characters that he dealt with, they were mostly religious and socially conventional men, but their ambitions had been such that they suffered because of these ambitious they suffered because of these ambitious convictions. They suffered because of some divine retribution. They suffered all because their greatest ambitions somehow were thwarted by some of the social and religious conventions, right? So we move ahead, and this is one of the what I found appealing quote by Dr. Faustus. Maybe for now we can skip it. Okay, these are two the images of the theater, Globe Theatre, owned by, of course, Shakespeare was one of the major shareholders in Globe Theatre, and this is how exactly the theatre and the construction of these theatrical ones used to be there. Now, William Shakespeare, and of course, before we move on to William Shakespeare, I think it's important to discuss whatever things and why Mr. Shakespeare had to move to writing sonnets and what had been the causes. In fact, play, now that we are amidst the pandemic situation, how can one also not take into account and not talk about the epidemic that happened in London too? And other than that, theatre, when it was banned later on under James II rule, or when Oliver Cromwell had to take and this turned into an interregnum period, Commonwealth period, theatre was banned primarily of this reason, because theatre started to be seen as a house, a hub of teaching bad values or moral values. And of course, it also became a matter of concern, an issue of public health as well. And of course, crime. Public health and crime. Crime, because when large crowds would gather, obviously pickpocketers, cut purses, scoundrels would be there, and they would, carry out all these rascal activities. At the same time, it was also seen ahead of where prostitutes could be found, where allegedly it was believed that innocent maids would be seduced, and respectable matrons would lose out their reputation. Respectable matrons would be corrupted eventually. And also these public gatherings became the hub of some of the issues that, in fact, bubonic plague that took place at that time. It was believed that these public gatherings in theatre, they were the largest breeding grounds for infection. They were super spreaders. These events were super spreaders, and these diseases can be curbed only when, for some time, theatre activities could be banned, and eventually it was banned, right? So whatever reputation theatre had seen, that it's a hub of idleness. Children, when they're idle, or apprentices when they're not indulging in work, or law students when they're supposed to put in their efforts while learning, and housewives when they're supposed to be, cooking and such other, and then of course great spiritual men when they should be meditating and they should be say revising on these doctoral knowledge, they spend their time and their afternoons in theater, and that's how it has a corrupted quality. It has, in a way, corrupted the masses. It has that very quality which puts the society generally on a degenerative space, right? So these moral, and that's how from Protestants we come down to the idea of how gradually these very moralist, the Puritans started to emerge. Why? Because they saw theater as the very nest of sedition. They saw the theater as the very nest of the spread of diseases, theater as the very nest of certain crimes to take place, right? And that is, and of course, the very idea that these theater and dramatic performances, where all the male actors were changing roles, were changing the clothes, performing the acts of a female as well. So this also would give rise to some heterosexual experiments and idea of homosexuality too, right? And this somehow also equally troubled the moralists of the age, that we later on call them as with the name of Puritans. Now, before me moving on to William Shakespeare, English playwright, poet, and actor, widely regarded as the greatest writer in English language and in the world's greatest dramatist. His extant works include collaborations, around 39 plays, sonnets, long poems, 3 long narrative poems, and few other verses. Some of them had also kind of uncertain authorship. His plays have been translated into almost every major living language and performed more often than not any other play. Now, Shakespeare, the most formidable literary figure, almost a flagship commodity, if I may use a word, almost a flagship commodity that he has become, with which everyone would now and then would like to engage in their literary arena, in their cultural arena, and someone such a kind of formidable figure whose magic, whose mystery is something hard to evade and equally hard to, in fact, formulate inclusively, right? So Shakespeare commanded, he exercised this clout, this reputation, even in his own times, but not posthumously, but certainly he exercised this power clout as well. And the engagement with the poet, not just posthumously, even during his time, had been endless, and he saw his career beginning early with, of course, as a playwright, with writing comedies and tragedies, but it did not gain its strength as much as we now believe that this had been a formidable figure throughout the Queen Elizabethan time, right? So in early 1590s, he began his career as a playwright, and he started off by writing comedies. He started off by writing history plays, and the earliest of these histories, they were gradually, of course, they were certainly based on the past kings, the ancestors, the English kings, and that's how the chronicle of it was brought straight away as, say, if not word to word, but as certainly a source of inspiration. And they became, if crude, they became the early sources of early attempts at tragedy. But realizing the atmosphere at large, and of course the literary atmosphere, the literary landscape, the dramatic landscape I'm talking of, he quickly moved on to create more serious work. He quickly moved on in around 1590s to create a new kind of ambitious history plays. Richard II was a popular one, and we have it here. History plays. Richard II had been a popular one, and then Henry IV, Henry V, first and second parts of Henry IV. All in all, he explored most of the dynasties of these feudal England in the past, and he was also responsible for bringing a new charm through his dramatic works, almost the birth of modern nation rule by this charismatic female monarch called Queen Elizabeth. And the years have not been mentioned, but history plays, that's how even students need to, maybe they can learn upon how in same years he wrote a succession of romantic comedies, Merchant of Venice, then the comedies I'm talking about, Merchant of Venice, The Merry Wives of Windsor, Much Ado About Nothing, and so forth. And then came the poetic richness and emotional complexity in these comedies. And then from 1601 to 1607, that is, this period produced a number of the dark tragedies, the tragic dramas. We have Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, then Antony and Cleopatra. In fact, Hamlet was written in the same year, 1601, when Twelfth Night was produced, right? Twelfth Night as a comedy. And these plays, they also reflected the very shift in his sensibility and his preference for the production that took place now. So from early historical plays to now serious comedy, say comedies, and of course serious tragedies, he were making a smooth transition as to explore the deeper issues of sensibility, the deeper issues of, say, emotional trauma and psychological drama, for that matter. Right? So 1601 to 1607 is an important period for Shakespeare's time, and it was also the time where concomitantly, he was producing comedies. That is from 1601 to 1604, right? This period of 3 years. Troilus and Cresside, all's well that ends well, Measure for Measure. These all were sufficiently different from earlier comedies, but this time they were more biting in tone. They were not just following those easily available out there comic conventions, and they were ruthlessly also questioning the value system and the values of the characters and the resolutions of the plot. Also because of his exercise of this power clout that he exercised, the clout that he now had, he could move deeply into writing such serious, intense kind of tragedies, and at the same time producing such deeper and richly dense kind of comedies. Right? So then, of course, these are his number one. Then he produced romances. Then two of Shakespeare's friends and fellow actors, John Hyminges and of course Henry Condell, they both in fact had been his friends and fellows as well, actors as well. They published his first folio. Now what happened is Shakespeare initially, and this debate I think it continues even till date, number of plays who had the authorship in the name of Shakespeare. This is always forever perennially in question, right? So Shakespeare himself apparently had no interest in preserving for the purpose of posterity, for the purpose of preserving it for younger generation, preserving the collection of his writings. And of course, he certainly was not there, not available for for clarifying the chronology of his plays. This was produced afterwards and so forth. This is why we find that when he wrote plays, this was done primarily for the purpose of performance for his company, and his scripts, which were only maybe passed hands down, some of the handwritten scripts, some of the manuscripts, some of the scribbled copies, and some of the playhouse books of record, or maybe pirated texts, shorthand reports after the performances. All these became the sources by which the authorship issue could be, if speculatively could be established, right? And initially, as it is written, that John Hyminges and Henry Condell, they published his first folio, and the first folio also consisted of 18 of his plays, and earlier than this, 18 of his plays previously had been published in his lifetime, but they were more or less were the part of quartos. Quartos were the inexpensive small format of books, and folios, they were the expensive larger printed volumes of books. They were called folio volume. The difference between quarto and folio, right? So this first folio, this was edited by these two friends, Hyminges and of course Henry Condell, and of course this was prefaced by the very popular poem by Ben Jonson. And this is something I thought it must be there if any discussion of Shakespeare. In few words, one can find how Ben Jonson has very appropriately valorized Shakespeare. Shakespeare is hailed precisely as not of an age. He was not of an age, but of all times. Now, we move on next to, there's also this, there must be, of course, talk about his poetry, that is his sonnets, the love sonnets, A Lover's Complaint, The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, Funeral Elegy by W.S. So, talking about his poetry, talking about his sonnets, the typical Queen Elizabethan England greatly produced a typical of a Petrarchan sonnet tradition, which functioned under that system of aristocratic patronage that came not just say fringe money or fringe benefits. It also came with protection. It also came with money. It also came with prestige, being able to carry a reputation among the men of letters. But Shakespeare he has written these poetic works for patronages, different kind of patronages too. And we find that this one, especially Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, they both were written for Henry Ridsley's nobleman. He was a nobleman, WH, that is how his initials are written. These were dedicated to the wealthy young nobleman called Henry Ridsley, and he was the Earl of Southampton. And among his different other, whatever with gallants, money, protection, if I may use the word, because he himself exercised a lot of power clout at that time, clout about himself. So the narrative poems, they won Shakespeare a fine reputation as far as its comparison with other poetic productions of the age that were concerned, right? Especially its comparison with the Petrarchan sonnet tradition. These poems, they found themselves exactly functioning in opposition to how Petrarchan sonnet tradition had been. He gave it a lot of innovations, he twisted it around, and he made the poetry, especially the sonnets, as a groundbreaking subject theme. They were no more now subjected to, or they were no more dedicated to a fair, chaste queen or a fair, chaste, a woman in general, but they were dedicated to a beautiful young man whom it was, again, out of speculations, it was believed that the very component of homosexuality can be found and can be sensed in these sonnets. And of course, this was also addressed to another, say, subject of the poem of these sonnets had been the Dark Lady, right? A very sexually promiscuous mistress, the Dark Lady. Now, this can also be seen as a deliberate attempt, being an iconoclast that he was, a deliberate attempt on his part to move away from the Petrarchan tradition, because he was functioning against what was expected of a Petrarchan male lover whose principal object of desire would include a white chaste woman who would praise her, love her, idolize her, and there would be this massive devotion to this lady. But we find a sexually promiscuous woman, Dark Lady, being indulged with another man, and at the same time the poet as well is being shown, or a beauteous young man is told that you must bring out your progeny in future. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So the despairing Petrarchan lover's mood is not depicted. We do not have melancholic kind of a sad lover who is troubled by this rejection, if not outright rejection, this confusion created by the chaste, aloof, blonde beauty. But we find that different other moods, for example, of delight, of pride, of shame, of guilt, of sexual guilt, disgust, and fear, they certainly are there. So 1 to 17, the very popular sonnets, 1 to 17, they were dedicated to the beauty of the young man, and where he talks about the destructive power of time. And he himself had this egoistical quality, if I may use the word, he himself had this ability that by which he can, through his permanence of beauty, he can make the beauty of this young man as permanent too, right? And of course, the remaining sonnets afterwards, they are dedicated to the Dark Lady, who's not a subject of some chaste, who's not, of course, a chaste woman, an aloof blonde beauty, or someone who is desired forever, but she's an alluring object. She's an object, a kind of degrading object of desire, right? So this is something how, as an iconoclast, he's moving right against what the tradition had been, and despite the Renaissance poetry, the Petrarchan sonnet tradition. So the Petrarchan tradition, in fact, the single most powerful influence on Renaissance love poetry was Petrarch, Mr. Francesco Petrarch, the 14th century Italian writer Petrarch, someone who gave and supplied a perfect model for poetry as a personal expression and as a virtuoso rhetorical display in the number of these poems. How that very counting of the syllables, making them into certain forms of iambic pentameters and counting these syllables on hand, and of course making the object of love to be desired forever, and the sighs and woes of this lover who's almost treating his beloved as a subject of God, as a goddess in itself. It all had its inspiration. In fact, right, not just an inspiration, it was entirely based on Petrarchan model of Petrarchan sonnet tradition. So what about this Petrarchan tradition? Petrarchan tradition, basically, Petrarch, he wrote scattered rhymes, he wrote rhyme sparse, and these rhyme sparse consisted of a number of poems and sonnet sequence. They all were dedicated to a woman called Laura, right? He created these nuanced sequences of sonnets, and they all express that unrequited passion, that unrequited desire for a young woman called Laura, right? But it so happened that this woman's untimely death and Petrarch's undying passion for her sustained, and he found himself amid this ecstatic joy and chaos and almost like a madness, not certainly a madness being a lunatic at all, but he found himself uh, experiencing some spiritual, some transcendental being and ecstatic joy that he received. And out of that torment of self-blame and self-justification, he composed these poems, these sonnets too. He wrote these beautiful conceits too. The sequence, this had been in, why do we call it sonnet sequence? Because they would more or less generate and of course, explain out the journey of the lover from the stages of how he found himself completely besotted by the beauty of the beloved, how he is trying to woo her, and this wooing, in fact, this very wooing stage, is it able to achieve these stages of acceptance or rejection? Most of the time it will be met with rejection or some ambiguous response. This will become probably the reason for the poet's despair and pain, and that's how it turned out to be a sequence that is tracing the journey of the poet's attraction towards his beloved subject. So Renaissance, now coming back to Renaissance poets, they found themselves, uh, they were not trying to aspire to write anything iconoclast. They were not trying to aspire to write something extraordinary or something that has never been tried before. But in fact, they actively embraced the rather avoided established forms, and one of them had been the Petrarchan form. And they particularly favored the love poems. Why the love poems? Because this very ability to write poems, this was a part of a larger cultural competence, almost as if how someone needs to move gracefully, how to carry themselves, how to carry a tune of a music, how to speak eloquently. This all somehow was also carried out in poetry as well. That is why that rhetorical virtuosity was to be found in these love poems as well. And also, men and women of this age, of the court tradition, they were expected to exhibit, they were expected to have some facility, in some knowledge in reciting verses. Not everyone, of course, but more or less this particular larger cahoot that found itself surrounding the Tudor monarch, surrounding the queen. They engaged in, and I'm talking about the courtiers, the country gentlemen, the artists of the court, the parsons, the bureaucrats that would visit the woman, the queen, sorry, the law students, the fashionable ladies of the court. They all somehow had tried their hands at making metaphors and counting syllables and shaping words into some sort of pleasing pattern. So this was the age to which love poems were gifted. This was the age that it came natural to them, almost internalized this way of being. So for them, these poems were no less than objects by which they can enter into those so-called zones of rhetorical world, right? And the poet would praise the Renaissance poet, or if the poet is following the Renaissance, the typical of the Petrarchan sonnet tradition, this poet would praise, he would blame the beloved, he would invite the beloved, he would commemorate his beauty, commemorate her beauty and commemorate her presence. In fact, the fact that she came in the poet's life, they would try and make excuses, they would persuade the beloved, they would warn the beloved, they would even insult themselves, they would lament and be in that despair moment. They would try even seduce, but all through these love poems. And as you can see on the screens, we're already running out of time now. As you can see on the screens, these are some of the traits of some of the characteristics of Renaissance poetry, that is Petrarchan sonnet tradition. I'll also come down to the other categories of Renaissance poetry, that is pastoral was as much in vogue as heroic poetry was, not just the Petrarchan sonnet tradition, right? So the thing is, overall, this Petrarchan sonnet tradition or Renaissance poetry in general, they were interested. Okay, this is typical of a sonnet, Renaissance poetry. They were interested not in some representational accuracy, right? Think of this, probably reminds us of the neoclassical poets of the latter day age, right? to be very accurate about how this imitation needs to be carried out, to be very accurate precisely how if academic Francois or La Pléiade has suggested those 5 rules, they must be sticked onto, and if they are not sticked onto, then it's not a good piece of poem. Then it's not following the neoclassical, neither the neoclassical way of imitation, nor the unities, nor the 5 acts and so forth, nor the poetic composition of verisimilitude and so forth, right? So this pricking detail was not something very a general trait of Renaissance poetry. It was rather the way the emotional intensity was conveyed using those metrical forms, say iambic pentameter. So we do know that Virgil and Homer had been using greatest of other forms, metrical forms. Think of dactyl hexameter. But this dactyl hexameter, thanks to Chaucer, that it gradually he started to get withered away with this form, brought rhyme royal, and eventually English became the part. And eventually we find that the more comfortable way of metrical pattern, that is unstressed and stressed, that is iambic pentameter, came into view. So what chiefly was a characteristic of Renaissance poetry was their ability to display very harmoniously a remarkable emotional intensity, and at the same time using these lines of rhymed iambic pentameters, and in a way bringing a harmony of the two in a way that displayed that rhetoric eloquence, something that you can read and enjoy and probably recite as well on different occasions. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I write it with the second hand, but came the tide and made my pains astray. This is in Spenser's stanza. Next one is the Shakespearean. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, rough winds to shake the darling buds of May. So that very eloquent, that quality of rhetorical quality to be able to sound well, recite it well, certainly is to be found in Renaissance poetry. Now, apart from that, as I said, that it is also about Renaissance poetry was not just about the ability to exhibit that eloquence, that rhetoric eloquence. It was also about an exquisite way of poetic labor, an exquisite workmanship, the great deal of poetic labor the poet has to go through and indulge into, so that the readers are almost drawn into these worlds of poems, almost drawn into the worlds of poems that or the different worlds that the poet is creating. Think of the Fair Queen by Spenser, right? So some common other characteristic of Renaissance poetry, the hero narratives, the Greek-Roman idyls, promoting humanity and focus on irony or satire commonly found in Shakespeare's poetry. So as a major literary mode of age, poetry somehow it found itself almost divided amid different trajectories, and it almost gotten into different kinds. Now this is something even Sir Philip Sidney in his defense of poetry mentioned, the different kinds of poetry. It had been taking into account, it had been writing about pastoral poems, the heroic poems, the lyrical one, the satiric, the elegiac poems and so forth. But it was the pastoral and the heroic poems that majorly ruled the Renaissance poetic landscape. Because the Renaissance poet, the typical of a successful Renaissance, or the celebrated Renaissance poet throughout Europe, he almost undertook or decided to honor his nation by and using its very own indigenous language, vernacular language, by writing the most prestigious kind of poetry. And of course, the prestigious one would come through heroic one, right? Heroic and pastoral both. And in 16th century England, we find that the major success that is attributed to heroic poetry, this had been done by Spenser's Fair Queen. And as I think I said it before, that Spenser, much like Roman poet Virgil, he followed almost the footsteps of Virgil, began his career through pastoral poems, through pastoral poetry, the Shepherd Calendar, and then claimed for or aspired for poet laureateship by coming up with this great piece of work called The Fair Queen, right? And Fair Queen altogether, it's almost in different books, one is drawn into this world of a hybrid world of this hybrid world of mythologies, this hybrid world of philosophy, this hybrid world of pastoral satire, this hybrid world of knights and damsels in distress and dragons and witches and and trees who are magical, the enchanted trees, and then the wicked magicians, the giant, the darker cave. So what you name it, and the element would be found in Fair Queen. So that is why it is more like a hybrid heroic work. Certainly followed the conventions of epic poetry, the classical epic. It mingled with romance, but it also took into account the medieval allegory. It also took into account the pastoral satire. It also took into account some of the mythological way of moving about in different or creating different narratives. It also took into account a slight condemnation of the politics of Queen Elizabeth, right? So Spencer, his very castle, King Colesman, was burned down when he was in Ireland, all thanks to the colonial ambitions that Queen Elizabethan Empire had over Ireland. And he did not quite like it, and he made sure that this criticism, if not a very blatant and an open condemnation, but this was certainly condemned in the epic poem, the Fair Queen. But of course, slanting way of, you cannot criticize the queen from whom you're demanding or expecting a patronage or expecting a huge sum of patronage. And let me also tell you, Queen Elizabeth, with the help of her advisors, was warned that Edmund Spenser was certainly against England's policy against Ireland, and he should not probably be given these benefits, and it should only be limited to some of the fringe benefits. But still, the Queen was generous enough. She was quite impressed and happy with this work, because this was primarily dedicated in the celebration of Queen Elizabeth, and of course the Protestant faith as well, and of course the English nation. And of course she was very generous with, say, Edmund Spenser. So beyond the court, Tottle's Miscellany and Elizabeth, maybe just 2 or more slides, maybe 5 more minutes, and then it'll be over. Beyond the court, Tottle's Miscellany and Elizabethan sonnet sequence. Eventually, the poetry of Thomas Watt and other courtly poets. Of course, Thomas Watt. These are objective pieces of information that any literature enthusiast would know. But what consequence they had? So, almost in its primitive stages, we find the love poems by Thomas Watt and Olaf Surrey and Henry Howard. But of course, they were perfected at the hands of Sir Philip Sidney, and of course these different other sonnet masters, Spenserian sonnet and Shakespearean sonnet as well. Eventually, the poetry of Thomas Watt and other courtly poets, it moved outside the court. 1557, Richard Tottle's Miscellany, it produced some of their poems in his innovative verse anthology, Songs and Sonnets. This best-selling book introduces new verse forms, genres, courtly lyrics to a much. So sonnet sequences dramatically increase in popularity with the pirated printing of Sir Philip Sidney. I think we're on the last slide. And of course, his Astrophil and Stella, the fact that it somehow got out of the pirated copies. Sir Philip Sidney, because of his position as a man of aristocracy, he did not wanted to emerge or establish himself as a poet, as a complete poet in itself. In fact, he called poetry as his vocation. I think the precise word I'm forgetting for the moment. He called poetry as his unelected vocation. Why? Because he was born in aristocracy, he was an elite man, but of course he died in a war, he died in a feud that happened, and almost in a very chivalric gesture, thy need is probably greater than mine, he ended up wounding himself by removing that thigh armor, and he died. But his greatest work, Astrophil and Stella in 1591, and of course the greatest piece of work for literary criticism, The Defense of Poetry. These two are seminal works of the age, celebrated and seminal as well. And we do have other poets of the same age, Samuel Daniel, Michael Drayton, then Campion, then Barnaby's Barney. Very important. Why? Because he was, with his parenthopy and parenthesis, he brought the element of erotic sonnets into being, and it was believed that Shakespeare was inspired when he was writing these sonnets for the Dark Lady. He also found inspiration in Barnaby's erotic sonnets, right? So Walter Raleigh, again, John Lyle produced his prose romance, Euphis, I think, in 1578, and this was met with a lot of success. Euphis, The Anatomy of Wit, a prose writing about romance. So that's how we see that Queen Elizabeth's time, when finally she died by the end of especially 1590s, we find that this long reign of Queen Elizabeth, it found itself amid a lot of problems because there was this greatest anxiety about who is to proceed next. She was childless, and childless, the last of her line, she was quite concerned as to refuse to name a successor. And though officially it was stated that while dying, she suffered from bouts of ill health and melancholy and sadness, and officially this has been brought out, then when she was dying, she named James II, James VI as the James VI, that is the son of Queen Mary, as the likeliest claimant to the throne, the next throne. And this is where his mother, to whom she has already executed, almost a murder had happened. So this Protestant James was very obviously a next in line, and he himself continued to exchange letters, in fact, very polite letters with Queen Elizabeth. And officially, as I said, that it was brought out openly that in her dying breath, it was believed that she designated James as her successor. So with James VI coming on and James II, of course, coming to the throne, we find that the very glittering nation of fashionable men and women, and of course the jittery nation, that it now will probably be led into in the hands of a new king, and it might itself find stuck in civil wars. This finally ended with the magnificent reign of Queen Elizabeth, which was also regarded as one of the high points in the history and culture of England. Not just history and culture, but also the literary history and culture of England. And with this, I come to the end.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna. As usual, it is always a pleasure, and it's really an honor to be a part of such a concrete and such a lucid presentation, and of course, well researched. And I'm sure the participants today who have joined for this lecture have definitely benefited from this, thought-provoking as well lecture that you have given. Of course, there was a lot of information. I'm sure participants have jotted down the information. Before we move ahead to the question answers, you can have a glass of water. And while doing that, can you please share with us, because we have right from graduation to, as I told you, we have a heterogeneous group. It would be really kind of you if you can just share some of the books that you have referred. If you just tell the names also, we will be happy. Our participants will be eager to know those. Which you would like to recommend for this particular section of history of English literature.
Right. So usually we end up, very famous, and these are very cliched ones, David Dash's and Norton anthologies and so forth. But I would suggest, to typical of an Indian literary enthusiast, an Indian literature student, that we must first of all proceed with Harish Trivedi's The History of English Literature. It's very elaborate, yet it is able to provide that holistic understanding of the age, and then moving on to the magnificent work and why we celebrate that, what exactly lied in that magnificence, why a work is called an outstanding work, what led to some of the major figures as to be termed as the important ones and the other ones as the minor ones, right? So of course, David Dash's, and you do have other Norton anthologies, Oxford anthologies, again, a brilliant one that is much more succinct in nature, that is very lucid as well, but a detailed one is always preferred. So for this, I would say Harish Trivedi's History of Compendium. This is called a Compendium of English Literature. This is a brilliant book, and also by an Indian author. So any day preferable.
Thank you so much. Now coming to the questions, as prior to your session we were discussing, we generally have some interesting questions.
Okay.
And this session is also having some of the interesting questions. Some of the participants have really put forward some very interesting questions, which I'm sure the BA students and the MS students who are here should benefit, because we were not fortunate enough to be a part of such gatherings and such plethora of resource persons. So I think this is indeed a blessing for all of us, especially the graduate students and MS students who are presently pursuing their graduation and MA. You all are really very, very blessed, and So many minds asking so many questions. So the first
Yeah.
interesting question is, any comments you would like to put forward on the Shakespeare-Marlowe controversy and Shakespeare's involvement in Marlowe's death?
Well, it so happened that we were discussing T.S. Eliot's this essay, The Function of Criticism, and he establishes very clearly that the moment a critic indulges in the interpretations of an author's life, these are nothing but based on a number of speculations. Number one, these speculations which are established on the basis of the biographies that are posthumously published, or on the basis of whatever available records that are there in the performance, during the performance, and afterwards. And a critic somehow reaches to this conclusion, again fictitiously establishes different and comes up with his starking observations. Oh, Shakespeare might have a hand in killing of Marlowe, and he might have. This could have been a possibility, but again, this was still reserved to the speculative stage. Recently, I also read an article where the name of it was found that the Dark Lady was also one of the prostitutes in London. Again, the going through the say historical one, the very biographical life of or seeking the interpretative aspect of a poet's or an author's life is entirely based on speculations. And based on that speculation, you find instances of his or her contribution in their works as well. So can we say that he completely vanished his rival, Shakespeare vanished his rival, or he had some hand in pointing out that controversy that happened? These are again two groups, two factions whose opinions are again divided, right? Does it help us lead to some conclusion? Yes, conclusions can be made. Had Mr. Marlowe been alive, he could have surpassed simply Shakespeare's Marvel. He could have certainly been a better playwright as compared to, look at his Tamburlaine, look at Dr. Foster, G of Malta, and so forth, and his history plays as well. And again, this famous allegation against Shakespeare of purlooning, of stealing from different sources, not acknowledging and whatnot. And because he was also an important stakeholder in Globe Theatre, so whatever these productions would be, they have to be under the name of these stakeholders, but they cannot be simply be turned or later on be called as the author of that work. Many of them had been collaborations too. Many of them had been freely picked up inspiration too. Many of them had been accused of purloining, of stealing, right? So these are, again, I personally believe, as I would say, that there would always be two groups, two factions. One who would believe that, well, this controversy happened and someone tried to outdo his rival this way and the other, which I do not. A piece of art should be focused onto itself, and then probably to take into account its larger concerns, one can delve deeper into its probable circumstances, right? So it's more of a literary historian's job to argue and be in that hair-splitting detail whether or not Shakespeare was being literature student. I think we should more be towards enjoying the aesthetic, what contributes to that idea of aesthetics, and thinking about what is it about Shakespeare that was so popular until now. He has this multidisciplinary kind of an, you see him being projected in cinemas too, in popular cinemas too. So what is it that underlies this man's mystery and his works that makes him so popular? This is what I would say.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
The next question is, how can we view the relationship between Renaissance and Neoclassicism or Enlightenment with regard to the revival of classical text and tradition?
That's a good question. With neoclassical one, first I'll take the neoclassical one. The neoclassical tradition of looking into the classical masters and imitating them, this came under certain circumstances, and the circumstances had been Charles too. When he came back from France, he almost eloped and he almost ran away from England, and of course for his life. When he came back, he also brought a lot of this Frenchly courtly tradition with himself. And what follows next was almost this this debauchery by this man by way of conducting himself, by way of introducing entertainment in the courtly life, and that is how we find the very period called comedy of manners later on emerge, right? So it was almost theater, drama, poetry. Overall, we find that it was in its moving towards decadence, degeneration, not moving upwards, because they were first of all imitating the French mannerism. Second of all, they were engaged most of them, the courtiers including, in the licentious behavior, seeing their very master. Charles too had many of the illegitimate sons as well. Third is, when we finally come down to this age of stability, we find the reign becoming a little stable. We find John Dryden, Alexander Pope, who looked to France as model for inspiration. And in France, with Académie Francois as this formal institution, think of probably Sahitya Academy of the indigenous one, if I try to create an establishment. Francois, Académie Francois, La Pléiade, these institutions, they clearly brought out rules as to be followed in poetry and in drama. Classical masters would be followed. No play can move beyond 5 acts. Seneca is the ultimate god. Senecan model would be the ultimate god. Third, verisimilitude should be there. No ghost appearance, no unbelievable things, no ghost, some apparitions coming and telling you, well, carry out the murder and so forth. Things should be believable. Fourth, the decorum should be maintained. And fifth, classical text needs to be reinterpreted as the source of inspiration. So what we find in neoclassical period is, that is why it is called new way of looking at classical antiquity period, not almost like a reinvention of it. And the earlier age, Renaissance, was a reawakening, a rebirth of ideas, plus their inspiration from the classical model. So the difference, if I may use these two terms, would be, one is a kind of inspiration from the past, and second is almost a reinvention of, reimagining of the same one. And the overall almost nitpicking following of rules and regulations, almost to the extent of being rigid, right? And the second part of it that was asked, what was it? One was the comparison with neoclassical, and second one was romantic, age of enlightenment, right?
Enlightenment,
okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So Renaissance was certainly the period where these new discoveries, scientific discoveries precisely, scientific thought came into being. But many of these, Copernicus' Hellenistic model of theory was proved to be wrong. They were in its initial stages of exploration. Sun was not at the center probably, and there were not just 2-3 planets revolving around. Johannes Kepler certainly established the planetary movement and so forth, but they still were again subjected to be tested and reinstated. They were still taken as hypothetical ones whose veracity was continuously being tested and rejected, and newfound theories came up as well, right? And with age of enlightenment came the very notion of different philosophical and epistemological discoveries. Something whose veracity could be well established using facts, the truth of beings could be established using very pragmatic way of argumentation. If you're stating a fact, if you're stating or establishing a fact, you are ensuring that you back it by certain pragmatic or rational, say reasoning behind it, and you deduct yourself to certain conclusion on the basis of certain hypotheses which you have tested and they have turned out to be true. So if I ask of, and if I think of which age was which was more speculative, or which was still in its initial stages of infancy, it was certainly the Renaissance one of the scientific discoveries and overall the pursuance of knowledge, and which was in a way found itself based on pragmatism. And later on, from this age of enlightenment theorists, we find that rationalists came up, pragmatics came up, and empirical school of study came up, all because these Enlightenment authors, philosophers were able to establish, discover the epistemologies of knowledge and establish them fully as well, right?
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
The next question is patronage with noblemen a major reason why poets and playwrights survived during the 13th and 14th century?
Not many of them, not majority of them, but certainly think of Edmund Spenser. Mr. Spenser had been very clear from day one that he has to achieve the poet laureateship, right? A poor man, not a man of high means, unlike Shakespeare or unlike other men, say Sir Philip Sidney, who had been earls and dukes, and who went out with their poetry out of their interest and vocation, unelected vocation, Sidney said. So for these men, it certainly came out of more they have, more out of some means of livelihood that they had to create. And this is also the reason that you find a prolific production of plays by these university poets. Why? Because they were almost competing every day with one another, right? One another, but the production of it, the production of these texts, and they had to sustain themselves, and they could only sustain themselves when they have these generous men, these noble men around to give them patronage, to give them some benefits, fringe benefits, and of course money as well, and so forth. And that's how they could. Spencer as well. Spencer could not directly enter the court, enter not very concretely, of course, could not make an entry into Queen Elizabeth Baton court. Edmund Spencer had almost like a middleman, a nobleman who was very much there in Queen Elizabeth court, who helped bringing out his reputation, who brought out his reputation. We do have a man who had great writing capacities, and look, he of course initiated the Shepherd calendar, and when he 1594, when he dedicated this fair queen, the queen was impressed, right? And despite his advisors telling the queen that not a generous amount of patronage should be given to Edmund Spencer, he was able to back it up as well, right? So certainly patronage as a system was an important one, and that is why anyone who sometimes feel exhausted and overwhelmed by, oh my God, so many works of the Renaissance dramatists, how could they even write it, and why they were producing it in the first place? This was also out of the problems of livelihood, the conditions, the mandatory conditions of carrying out their lives. And only when they produce greatest work, they could expect people gifting them with castles, with money and whatnot, right?
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, how does the Elizabethan belief in the great chain of being impact the writing of Shakespeare and other dramatists of this age?
Can you repeat it, or can I see it? The question.
How does the Elizabethan belief in the great chain of being impact the writing of Shakespeare and other dramatists of this age?
Well, great chain of being. I'm not precisely very clear with this particular phrase. Is the person referring to the very theory of King's body in it here?
The great chain of being during the 15th century and 16th century, they were like B-E-I-N-G, being.
Being, okay, existence, being. Great chain of being. Well, maybe I might have to read a maybe different set of critics about it in order to establish, because again, this is more about when you try and explore the interpretative and biographical part of a poet's life or an author's or a writer's life, you got to be, it has to be based on speculations as well, right? Otherwise, when we are considering a piece of art sufficient onto itself, self-contained in itself, then only probably we can ignore in the background these little and larger details about. But they certainly contribute to, I'm not denying it, they certainly contribute to, probably I'll have to read more about this to establish the connection between Great Chain of Being by Elizabeth and Shakespeare's impact on his writing.
Okay. The next question is, considering that Elizabeth was a very clever, smart queen, as she expanded the horizon of politics, military, religion during her reign, then why is it so that she did not work towards improving the conditions of women?
That's what ironically
being herself a woman in one of the most powerful positions.
Ironically, see, this is not something that easy of a change that a single woman in a span of say, if I may quickly calculate, say 50 years or 60 years can do so, right? Plato in his Republic has initially mentioned, and I think women and children and animals, they all were treated as same. They all were treated as, and in fact, this has been an age where women, children, animals, they were seen as powerless, vulnerable creatures who are suitable for certain kinds of everyday activities and should not somehow move towards the very prerogative that is considered of men. For example, thinking, for example, learning, for example, the intellect component of it. And women usually associated with bouts of great emotions, passions, and so forth, everything to do with heart. Think of Mary Wollstonecraft of Vindication of the Rights of Women. This is what she precisely criticized, right? That why is that this has been the case, that since ages, women are associated with the idea of passion, human emotions, and the intense emotion, and they're seen as incapable of having any intellect or cerebral component to it, right? Which is, again, The mind does not know the sex of its own. The mind do not have a sex at all, right? Why can't a queen make changes to it? Because primarily her priorities herself had been to sustain and to save her reign. When I said that a number of these controversies and conspiracies to kill her, to overthrow the woman, of course, to carry out her murder had been invoked, and she was constantly under pressure to find out through her spies, find out through her secret men, if at all any of such of these uh, acts that were planned out of almost overthrowing the king or the queen, right? So probably this might have been the least of her priorities. Again, this is based on speculation, and rightly so. This was a woman who was very indulgent in politics of the time. Politics, she would call up a number of ambassadors from Spain, from different other places, and these ambassadors would all come with a particular purpose in mind, that is to be able to consolidate that very power if the queen says yes to that particular king, right? So this probably, out of that courtly life, this thinking about the masses at large would be the least thing, I imagine, on her mind. And that's how thinking about women writers, women in Renaissance, or why not something was not done. This, in fact, was not even carried out in the next age as well. Only when, with these important figures as Mary Wollstonecraft and later on Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, when they're writing and they're imagining. That's why Virginia Woolf can probably imagine, go back in time and think of what if a woman is born to Shakespeare's father, and she had the same genius to her, but because her role was confined to house and these everyday duties, we cannot see Judith Shakespeare or a woman Shakespeare to have emerged. The greatest of such a writer could ever emerge, or say a woman who could surpass Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace, right? So this is something probably the least of their priorities had been, and this had been quite a time, quite a country which has seen itself within certain civil strifes, political turmoils, and political conflicts. And Reformation probably initiated with religion. Imagine, so how far these men, these vulnerable creatures, women, children, animals, and etc., would be in line when it comes to reforming, or when it comes to bringing reforming in society, general reformation in society. Of course, it had to be. That's why we find around in 17th and 18th century, it was at least brought out in open that reformations or various political civil rights need to be given to women as well, right?
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
The next question is, what about the status of Catholic writers in Protestant England? Any inputs?
Yes. In fact, I should have, I think, but may not be the part of the outstanding work. Bible, the moment it went out from the clutches of typical of a Roman Catholic authority, when it was out there, published vigorously, and we do find in the next century King's Bible emerging, right? King James I almost employing 60 of these priests and men and linguists, if I may use the word linguist, to compose of this King's Bible. That means we found that the state and condition of Bible now moved into free hands. Free hands, these priests believing in the very notion of scripture being the authority, not these papal authority or the heretic authority or the authorities of these male clerics who would allow them some salvation. Once these scriptures, once Bible was in a way given in the hands of common people, given not literally, but of course it was made much more democratized, certainly Catholic religion had to face. And whatever writings of Catholic faith, whatever writings of Catholic religion had been there, they either met with a lot of censorship, they were burned down, or the writers of it would find themselves typically assassinated and getting caught up in Tower of London. Assassinated typically, yeah.
We take the last question of the day. Can you suggest any movie or any web series which will give a more input or in-depth analysis or clear understanding of this particular age?
Well, to be honest, I do not have much time to watch them, and I can't even recall the number of series as well. But I can find it out certainly, and I can say forward it to Professor Saikot Banerjee, and he can certainly address it to the students then. I am not into a very television kind of a person or cinema, though I have indulged in. I presented a paper at Old Dominion University, Virginia, a paper on Shakespeare's Hamlet and its rendition by Vishal Bhardwaj, Heather, certainly a cinematic rendition, but very far away from these web series and following closely these web series in the first place.
Thank you so much. With that, we come to the conclusion of a very engaging and enriching session, both in terms of the content, the delivery of the lecture, as well as the thorough engagement of the question answer session as well. As promised before the commencement of the lecture, we were in for a cerebral treat and we thoroughly enjoyed. I'm sure the participants have enjoyed thoroughly.
Thank you too for being so patient and sitting for almost 2.5 and almost 3 hours and patiently listening to the entire lecture. Yeah.
Before we conclude, I would request my co-organizer, in fact, the lady behind this, the brain behind this series, Dr. Basudhara Roy, to please convey her vote of thanks.
Thank you. And I don't think that, after such a beautiful and such a well-organized session, we can have words enough to thank our resource person. Professor Arora has done thorough justice to this topic because the period is so rich and it's so variegated that it would have been very difficult to summarize its various aspects in one session. And as you can see, the length of the session, as she pointed out, it's around 3 hours that she has been continuously, talking, and we have taxed her energy and her patience, and we are very, very grateful with us this evening. Thank you to all the participants who have been a wonderful audience, who came up with wonderful questions that added further dimensions to the topic. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.